Good afternoon, everyone. Coming to you here from the home studio as usual, and wanting to give you a couple of points, several points, I suppose, about the new regime that we're looking at in chapters 3 and 4 of the American political history, and want to try to tie this into the model we've been using. First of all, in case you have forgotten, I gave you a handout that spells out the main characteristics of a political regime. And let me hold that up for you using my high-tech idea here of filming a piece of paper that I'm holding. There we go. Okay. Political institutions, political culture, and political behavior. Okay. With political debates, tensions, and crises in the middle. If you need me to send that to you or anything, just please tell me. But that's the idea here of the way a political regime operates. Remember that a political regime operates according to certain practices, with certain institutions, with certain political behavior. And we want to try to analyze, or I want to try to analyze, I don't know if you do, I want to try to analyze this beginnings of the democratic culture here in the United States with these categories. First of all, what do we call this regime? Well, the first one that we looked at last week was the deferential Republican regime. This is a term used by Morton Keller. It's the regime kind of set up by the Constitution, hierarchical, the best people as defined by status and wealth, and tend to be the political leaders. And it's very much not a pure democracy. Now, the second regime that emerges here as the country becomes more small d democratic in terms of less trust put necessarily in hierarchies, more egalitarian, westward expansion, all the things I talked about in the video before this week's Unit 1 check, or sorry, this week's Week 4 check. That has produced some new conditions, okay? And we can call this the party democratic regime, because it is more small d democratic, more average people are voting. There's been a reduction of those property requirements, right, that are necessary for voting, and towards universal suffrage or all white men voting, okay, universal suffrage for white men. And interestingly enough, you also see, in some places anyway, the decline of women's voting in the few places where that existed. Also, black men losing the right to vote in some places. So it really is kind of a white man's democracy here, with more and more the idea here of all white men who are citizens can vote. And now also we have, that's the democratic part. The party part of the party democratic regime is that we have a new party system. And instead of just being kind of factions that are organizing different interests, now we have a more acknowledged political party system that's going to grow. And that's important too. So that's why Keller and now Kistler is going to call it the party democratic regime. Okay, let's analyze it with these different categories. First, political institutions. The Constitution remains the same here in this period. And we have our governments, our federal, state, and local governments. What's different there? Well, first of all, Congress is still the legislature. Congress has the legislative power in the Constitution. That is constant. The judiciary does become more important. We saw last time how the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, was able to assert its role of judicial review, and that continues to be the case. We also see that as the economy becomes more kind of free market, property rights, a lot of that's helped by the courts as we see an American economy growing, and not just local economies, but a larger American economy grows. Well, how do you decide whose property rights prevail, how you define property rights, how you define and enforce contracts, a lot of that is decided in the courts. Okay, so the courts are very important there, and they continue to be very important to this day. It's something that David Bodenhammer points out in his little introduction on the Constitution. One kind of interesting clash during this period is that in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, there are disputes famously about how to deal with the Cherokee and other Indian groups in the South and other places too. This is a major question of American history. And the Georgia legislature wanted to remove the Cherokees from Georgia. Jackson very much supported that. And when the Supreme Court said that the Georgia legislature could not do everything it wanted to do, Andrew Jackson simply ignored the Supreme Court and allowed the Cherokees to be removed. So there you see the problem of the judiciary in a way, or the challenge of it, because they may make rulings, but they do depend on the other branches to respect them. And largely in American history, since the 1800s and before, in most cases, the judiciary has been respected, but there's sometimes some criticisms and sometimes they're ignored. So not usually, though. Now, the presidency also has a real interesting figure come into it. That is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, as you read about in the book, was a war hero and a major political figure, and was maybe the first small d Democratic president, as well as the first large D, as in Democratic Party president. And he has a great sense of charisma. He is well connected to his legions of fans, and very much seen as kind of a people's president. So it becomes more connected to the popular vote. And we really see a lot of states say that their electors are going to be chosen by the popular vote in that state, as we have it today. Okay, so everything's kind of becoming more small d Democratic. The average person's vote is sought after by politicians. More and more decisions are allowed to be made by democracy, for better or worse, depending on your view of the wisdom of the common person. Now, we also have here political parties as political institutions, right? And they are pretty important here. They're growing, and this is our second party system, it's sometimes called. And here we have the building, first of all, of the democracy, or the Democratic Party. It's styled itself as the democracy sometimes. The Democratic Party is basically the party of Andrew Jackson, and it champions the common white man. It champions the cause of Andrew Jackson against the political elites, as they would say. And we also see the spoils system, where loyal party members are rewarded with government jobs after elections. Okay. Now, in opposition to Andrew Jackson and his accession to the presidency are the Whigs. Now, why do they call themselves the Whigs? It's WHIGS, Whigs. That is taken from English politics. Okay. So those who criticize Andrew Jackson will sometimes call him King Andrew the First. Okay. He's a tyrant. He's a monarch. He's a demagogue, right? And so who are the opposition to the monarchy? Well, in England, it's the Whigs are the ones who want to limit the monarchy. And so the American Whigs are those who are opposed to the man they criticize as King Andrew the First. Okay. Now, this dispute between the two parties is a variation on the old Federalist and Democratic Republican dispute that we saw week 3. All right. But it's now with a much more democratic, small d Democratic outreach to the common person. So what's the main dispute? Well, the big question is whether the federal government should be more or less powerful. One of the things that Andrew Jackson had run on was that there are these kind of elites in in the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and in the government who are trying to just help themselves. And one of the ways they do that is by making the federal government more powerful, having the government spend money on improving the economy and improving the transportation system, the national bank, things like this. And that he believes is wrong because what it does is it just helps the well-connected people. Okay, so while King Andrew I, or President Andrew Jackson, is a powerful figure, he actually believes in a more limited government that let the states build the roads. Don't let the government do anything that's not explicitly spelled out in the Constitution. Shouldn't have a national bank because that's not in the Constitution. Hopefully this sounds a bit familiar to the old dispute between, say, Jefferson and Hamilton. So you need to have a limited government that can't do too much, because otherwise what it does with its power is it doesn't help people. It actually just helps the well-connected. Okay, that's a very common theme in American life, American political life. All right. Now, the next part of this is that you get the Whigs saying, no, the federal government needs to take a little bit of a stronger hand to create this national economy, to improve the country with roads and canals and eventually support the expansion of railroads. And they're more comfortable with the idea of a strong government that will help the country develop. Okay, we're not talking about a strong government in the sense we see it today, but more a government that will help to develop a strong national economy, not necessarily in giving out welfare benefits. Okay, and one of the ways you see this dispute is the bank war. Okay, the second national bank had been chartered in 1816, and Andrew Jackson hated the bank. He thought that, again, it was this elite in Washington, D.C. and other places that had tried to help themselves. And the bank was actually competing with state banks and with private banks. And so he wanted to kill the bank. And he did. And he thought it was wrong. The Whigs, on the other hand, thought that the bank was good and it helped to promote a strong national economy. Now, that's one of the main issues here, is not only the personality of Jackson and his way of doing things, but also the debate over the federal role in the economy. Now, parties, one of the important things about parties is that they aggregate interests. They bundle together coalitions. They get groups of people together who may not have everything in common, but they have enough in common to vote the same way and therefore have a chance of getting people in office that they agree with.
I think her family is here.
Oh, really?
Pearl's family.
Pearl's family. Okay. Yes. Update from Sabrina. The two different groups here are the Democrats. Again, the Democratic Party. They're agreeing with Jackson about the importance of limiting the federal government, having a small central government. Most of their political power they would want at the state level. And also people who are concerned that they didn't really benefit from the national economy. The national economy was the national market economy was good for some, and others like small farmers and small artisans that didn't feel like they had as much to gain from commerce. Okay, so there were those who were concerned about that, and some plantation owners too. Okay. On the other hand, there was also Catholics and non-evangelical Christians, those who weren't necessarily part of the Great Awakening and the big religious revivals, who were concerned about the evangelical influence in the Whig Party, okay, and in the country as a whole. The Whigs, on the other hand, they stood to benefit from the national market. They often were people who were more optimistic about it. So these could be, again, great Southern planters. It could be small farmers, small artisans who said, yeah, we're going to benefit from a bigger national market economy where we can actually sell. Okay. And so the Whigs also attracted those who, like evangelical Christians sometimes, who wanted a more moral America. Okay. Who could save America, they thought, through their moral reforms, not save America, but could improve America with more moral reforms. Okay. Now, both of these, in terms of political behavior, we have campaigns and elections and party newspapers that inform the voters. And all these are, things are very partisan in a lot of ways. And it's an important part of people's identity and recreation because there's parades and barbecues and party events. Election day is a big deal. And so we see these parties reaching the average person, engaging them in the political process. And Paul Vallely says, political parties are great at actually integrating people in as citizens, helping them to be citizens. So as much as people get upset about political parties sometimes, one of the things they do is give people a chance to be part of the political process, to think of themselves as citizens, and to try to influence political life. Okay. Political parties also have lots of things that irritate people too, but that's an important thing to think about. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video now, and I'm going to record another one in just a moment.